Gideon Mercer signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning without looking up. Elara stood across the conference table in the law firm where they'd drawn up their marriage contract 6 years earlier, and she watched her husband of 6 years initial each page with the same efficiency he used to approve quarterly reports. His pen moved fast. His jaw was set. His eyes never once found her face. The lawyer slid the final page across the marble surface. Gideon signed it, closed the folder, stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the room. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't even pause at the door. And Elara, 31 years old, her hands folded in her lap, her spine perfectly straight, sat in that chair for 40 seconds after he left and did not make a single sound. What Gideon didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the woman sitting across from that empty chair was not who she appeared to be. She never had been. What? If you've ever been thrown away by someone who didn't know your worth, stay with me, because this story is about what happens after. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part to the end. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The morning Gideon Mercer decided to end his marriage, he told his assistant first. That detail would matter later. That detail would be one of the things Elara turned over in her mind during the long months that followed. That Marcus, a 26-year-old who scheduled Gideon's dental cleanings and ordered his dry cleaning, had known before she did. Gideon had rehearsed the conversation too. She could tell from the way he delivered it, measured, controlled. Not cruel exactly, but clinical in a way that was somehow worse than cruelty. "This isn't working," he said. He was standing in the kitchen of their Upper East Side apartment, already dressed for the office, coffee in hand. "It hasn't been working for a long time." Elara was at the counter with her tea. She hadn't slept well. She rarely did anymore. "I know," she said. That surprised him. She could see it in the small tightening around his eyes, the micro-expression she'd spent 6 years learning to read. He had expected resistance, tears, maybe, a scene. What he got was a woman who set down her cup carefully and asked, "How long have you been planning this?" "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "This isn't about planning, it's about being honest. When did you decide?" He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name, and then it was gone. 3 months ago. 3 months. She'd cooked dinner for him, attended his mother's birthday party, sat beside him at the Lennox Foundation Gala, and smiled at people she barely knew. 3 months of a marriage that had already, in his mind, ended. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" He set down his coffee. "That's all you have to say?" "What do you want me to say, Gideon?" He didn't answer. And she understood in that silence that he'd wanted the scene after all. He'd wanted her to beg, or rage, or fall apart, something that would have justified his decision, something that would have made her small enough to leave without guilt. She didn't give him that. "I'll move into the guest room," she said, "until the lawyers sort out the paperwork." She picked up her tea and walked out of the kitchen. What? The story. Gideon told his family was simple. Elara hadn't grown with him. She was a good woman, he said, but she wasn't built for the world he was building. She was too quiet, too contained. She had no ambition beyond their home, no drive beyond making things comfortable. He needed a partner who could stand beside him in rooms that mattered. His mother, Constance Mercer, received this explanation with the particular brand of magnanimous sympathy that wealthy women of her generation had perfected over decades of practice. "I always liked her," Constance said, which everyone understood to mean the opposite. "I hope she'll be all right." His father, Leonard Mercer, said nothing. He poured himself a scotch and watched Gideon across the rim of his glass with the flat, evaluating gaze of a man calculating an outcome. Gideon didn't notice his father's expression. He was already on his phone, already moving forward, already done. What Elara heard through the walls of the guest room that night was the sound of Gideon laughing at something on television, casual and easy, a man relieved of a burden. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and made herself breathe slowly. In, out, in. She had survived worse than this. She just couldn't tell anyone that. The divorce took 11 weeks. Elara's lawyer, a quiet, precise woman named Dana Hollis, who came recommended by someone Elara did not name, negotiated a settlement that was fair and unremarkable. Elara asked for nothing beyond what was already hers. She did not fight for the apartment. She did not contest the timeline. She signed cleanly and left. The morning after the papers were finalized, she called a number she had not dialed in 3 years. It rang twice. "I need to come back," she said. The voice on the other end was calm, unhurried. "We know. We've been watching." She closed her eyes. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that you needed the cover. Good thing you had it." She didn't respond to that. Instead, she asked, "How soon?" "Whenever you're ready." She looked around the small, furnished apartment she'd moved into 2 weeks earlier. A single suitcase, a laptop. The framed photograph she'd brought from the guest room, not of Gideon, never of Gideon, of a harbor at sunset, somewhere cold and specific, that only meant something to people who knew. "Tomorrow," she said. Here is what Gideon Mercer did not know about the woman he divorced. He did not know that her name before Elara Voss was something else entirely, something that appeared on no public record and in no search engine. He did not know that she had spent 4 years working in international private security before she met him at a conference in Geneva. Not as a guest, not as a +1, but as the person responsible for keeping 3 of the attendees alive. He did not know that the quiet, contained woman he found unambitious had, by the age of 27, operated in 6 countries under 4 different identities, and that the stillness he mistook for emptiness was the trained stillness of someone who had learned to think faster than her face could move. He did not know that she had chosen to marry him. Not out of love, at first. Or not only love. She had been assigned to monitor a threat that moved through the Mercer financial network, a threat of money laundering that connected to something much larger, much darker. And Gideon himself had been, initially, a target of her scrutiny. But somewhere in the 18 months of that work, something had shifted. She'd watched him navigate a crisis that would have broken lesser men. She'd seen him sit with his grandmother in the hospital for 6 straight hours, holding her hand without his phone in sight. She'd seen him once stop his car to help an old woman struggling with groceries in the rain. She'd made a choice that her handlers had warned her against. She'd let herself fall in love with a man she was supposed to be watching. And she had pulled back from the work, not entirely, never entirely, but enough to become Elara Voss, enough to become someone who could sit across a dinner table and seem ordinary, enough to try. The problem was that Gideon's world had kept moving. The threat she'd been monitoring had evolved, had grown teeth, and by the time she understood what it had become, she was already inside it. Not as an operative, as a wife, as a liability. The call she received 6 weeks into her marriage, a call she took in the bathroom with the shower running, perched on the edge of the tub in the dark, had been her first real warning. "There are people inside Leonard Mercer's network who know what you are," the voice had said. "Not everything, but enough to make you dangerous to them." How dangerous? Dangerous enough. She had sat there for a long time after that call. She had listened to the shower and to the sounds of Gideon moving around the bedroom on the other side of the wall, and she had made the calculation that operatives made when the variables shifted: threat level, exposure, asset protection, exit timeline. She had not left. That was the decision she would spend years examining. She had not left because she told herself she could manage it. She could contain it. She was good enough, careful enough, disciplined enough to hold the line between what she was and what she had chosen to be. She was wrong about that, but she hadn't known it yet. The night she did know, the night everything became clear, was a Thursday in March, 18 months into their marriage. She was coming home from what Gideon believed was a book club. She was actually returning from a dead drop in Midtown, where she'd passed information to a contact she'd maintained carefully, quietly, for 2 years. The information was routine. The return home should have been routine. It wasn't. She noticed the car because it was parked at the wrong angle. Small thing. Most people wouldn't register it. She registered everything. That was the job, the job she'd never entirely left. And she registered the angle of that car and the man sitting in it, who was angled not toward the building entrance, but toward the block she'd approached from. She didn't go home that night. She called Gideon from a payphone. There were still a few in the city, if you knew where, and told him she was staying with a friend. A headache, nothing serious. He said okay and hung up quickly, and she heard, faintly, a woman's voice in the background before the line cut. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and absorbed 2 pieces of information simultaneously. Someone was watching her building, and her husband was not alone. She didn't cry. She was very far past the point of crying. She found a hotel 3 neighborhoods away, paid cash, and sat on the edge of the bed with her phone and her laptop, and the cold, precise clarity that came when emotion got out of the way, and only the work remained. By morning, she had made 3 decisions. First, she was going to vanish. Second, she was going to find out exactly who was watching her, and why, and who had ordered it. Third, when the time came, she was going to come back. The divorce happened because she engineered it, not the infidelity. Gideon had managed that on his own, and honestly, she was unsurprised. But the process of becoming visibly ordinary, visibly unambitious, visibly useless to his ambitions, that had been deliberate. She had made herself easier to leave. She had made herself smaller, quieter, more contained, so that when he walked away, he would do it completely, and no one, not his father, not his father's network, not the people watching her building, would think she was anything other than discarded. A discarded woman was beneath notice. A discarded woman could disappear without raising suspicion. A discarded woman could rebuild an entire operation from the ground up, while the people who'd wanted her dead assumed she was somewhere licking her wounds. The Tuesday morning she sat in that law firm while Gideon initialed his way through the paperwork, she had already been in contact with 2 former colleagues, a financial attorney in Zurich, and the man who would become the first client of the firm she was about to register under a different name. When Gideon walked out of that room without looking back, she allowed herself exactly 40 seconds of stillness. Not grief, not shock, preparation. Then she picked up her bag, thanked the lawyer, and walked out into the street. 3 years is a long time. It is also almost nothing. Elara built the company she called Vantage International Security from an office the size of a large closet in a building in Lower Manhattan, with 2 partners she trusted completely, and a client list that began with 3 names and grew, carefully, methodically, without rushing, the way she did everything. She slept 6 hours a night. She ran 5 miles every morning before the city fully woke. She ate at her desk more often than not, and she had learned in the years since the marriage that she preferred her own company to the alternative. She was not lonely. She told herself this frequently enough that she believed it about 70% of the time. The work was the thing. The work had always been the thing. Vantage grew because she was exceptional at it, at protecting assets, at finding the gaps in security architectures that no one else thought to look for, at managing the precise, high-stakes intersections where money and power and threat lived together in close quarters. Her clients were executives, international businesses, the occasional political figure whose handlers trusted no one else. They didn't know her history. They didn't need to. They knew that Vantage got results. What they didn't know was that half of what Vantage did existed on 2 tracks simultaneously. The visible track, legitimate security consultation. The invisible track, the slow, patient accumulation of evidence against a criminal network that moved money through the Mercer financial empire like blood through an artery. She was not done with Leonard Mercer. She had never been done. The call that changed the trajectory of everything came on a Wednesday evening when she was working late, her jacket over the back of her chair, a cold cup of coffee at her elbow. An unknown number. She answered it because she answered all unknown numbers. You never knew. "I've been looking for you for 3 years, the voice said. It was a voice she knew, low, unhurried, carrying the particular quality of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to make people listen. Vittorio Kane. She was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "You found the wrong number." "I found exactly the right number," he said. "I also found the right building, the right firm, and the right woman. I've been thorough." "What do you want?" There was a pause. Not a hesitation. Vittorio Kane did not hesitate, but the deliberate pause of a man choosing his words with the care of someone who understood their weight. "I want to thank you," he said. 5 years ago, in Prague. I know it was you." Her hand had gone very still on the desk. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You don't have to confirm it," he said. "I'm not calling for confirmation. I'm calling because the situation has changed, and I think you know it, and I think we've been moving toward the same target from different directions for long enough that it's time we stopped pretending otherwise." She looked at the wall across from her desk, where she'd pinned nothing. She never pinned anything to walls. An old habit. And she considered what it meant that Vittorio Kane had found her. "I'll need 24 hours, she said. I'll give you 48, he said. There's no rush. There's also no exit from this that doesn't go through Leonard Mercer, and you know that as well as I do. The line went quiet. She set the phone down and looked at her cold coffee for a long moment. Then she pulled a fresh legal pad from her drawer and started writing. The 48 hours had already started. She had saved Vittorio Cane's life in Prague, but not intentionally. Or not only intentionally, she'd been running a completely separate operation, tracking the movement of a man named Dressner, who moved stolen identities across 3 continents for a network she'd been embedded in for 7 months, when she'd spotted the tail. 2 men, good but not great, following a third man she hadn't initially identified. By the time she made the identification, she had 30 seconds to decide. She decided. It wasn't altruism. Vittorio Cane's survival, she'd assessed in those 30 seconds, was operationally useful. A dead Cane created a power vacuum that made her own work significantly more complicated. She made 1 call, redirected a car, and created exactly enough chaos to pull his tail off him long enough for him to move. She never introduced herself. She was gone before he could turn around. But clearly, he was better than she'd given him credit for. And now he'd found her. She looked down at the legal pad, at the names she'd written, at the intersecting lines she'd drawn between them. The 48 hours, she suspected, were going to change everything. Outside the window, the city was doing what the city always did, loud, relentless, indifferent. Elara Voss, the woman Gideon Mercer had signed away on a Tuesday morning, capped her pen and got back to work. The 48 hours Vittorio Cane had given her passed in exactly the way she'd expected. Without sleep, without distraction, and with the slow, methodical accumulation of information that confirmed what she'd already suspected but hadn't yet been able to prove. She worked through the first night with 2 laptops open side by side, cross-referencing financial records she'd been building for 14 months against a new variable. Vittorio Cane's known network, his known enemies, his known associates in the 3 industries where a man like him operated simultaneously and without apology. She drank bad coffee and ate half a sandwich she'd bought at 8 o'clock and forgotten by 9, and by 3 in the morning, she had drawn 6 new lines on her legal pad, connecting names she hadn't previously connected. The picture that emerged was not a surprise. It was worse than a surprise you could absorb in the moment. What she was looking at required a different kind of processing, the cold, flat recognition of a pattern you'd half seen for years without letting yourself see it fully, because seeing it fully meant accepting what it meant. Leonard Mercer's financial network was not just laundering money. It was providing infrastructure, transportation, communication, identity documentation, for people who moved other people. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed through her nose for 60 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and dialed. Vittorio Cane answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been awake too. "How much do you know?" she asked. No preamble. "Enough to know I needed to find you." That's not an answer. "I know about the transportation network," he said. "I know about 3 of the shell companies. I know that 2 of Leonard Mercer's senior financial officers have been redirecting funds through a structure that took me 8 months to trace. And I know that the man who built that structure was also the man who ordered the surveillance on your building 3 years ago." She was quiet. "You knew about the surveillance," he said. It wasn't a question. "I knew. And you let Mercer divorce you anyway." "I made Mercer divorce me," she said. "There's a difference." Another pause. She could hear him breathing, slow, controlled, a man sitting somewhere still in the middle of the night. "I need to meet you in person." "I know. Tomorrow, noon. There's a restaurant on—" "I'll choose the location," she said. "I'll send you an address at 11. She hung up before he could respond. It wasn't rudeness, it was protocol. She didn't meet people at locations she hadn't chosen herself, and she didn't make exceptions for Vittorio Cane any more than she made them for anyone else. She went back to her laptops and worked until dawn. The restaurant she chose was a small Korean place in a neighborhood that didn't attract attention. Not too quiet, not too loud, booths with high backs. An owner she'd done a favor for once that he'd never forgotten and never mentioned. She arrived 20 minutes early, took the booth in the back corner with sight lines to both the entrance and the kitchen door, and ordered tea she didn't intend to drink. Vittorio Cane arrived at exactly noon. She recognized him immediately, though she'd never officially met him. She'd studied photographs, read briefings, built a working profile of a man whose public face was real estate development, and whose private architecture was something considerably more complex. In photographs, he looked like what he was. Mid-40s, dark-haired, built like a man who'd spent time doing physical things before he'd had people to do them for him. He moved through the restaurant with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life been uncertain about whether he belonged somewhere. He had one man with him. She noted that. One, not three, not five. Either he trusted her more than she'd have trusted him, or he was making a point about trust itself. He slid into the booth across from her, looked at her for a moment without speaking, and then said, "You're smaller than I expected." "You're less guarded than I expected," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. "I left the rest of my security 2 blocks away. I thought it might be a good opening gesture." "It is." He looked at her with the direct, unhesitating focus of someone who'd built a career on reading people quickly and accurately. She held his gaze without effort. She'd been looked at by people who were better at it than he was. "You saved my life in Prague," he said. "I created a diversion that incidentally benefited you," she said. "I wasn't saving your life. I was protecting an operation. The distinction matters to you. It's the accurate version." He leaned back slightly. His hands were on the table, relaxed. She noted them. It was habit. She noted everyone's hands. "All right," he said. "Here's what I know. And then you can tell me what you know. And we can figure out how much of this we've been running in parallel." "Start with the name Dresdner," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, he was too controlled for surprise, but a recalibration. A man adjusting his estimate of someone. "You know about Dresdner?" "I spent 7 months embedded in his network." Now the almost smile became something more definite. "Then you know more than I do." "Probably," she said. "Tell me what you have anyway." "What?" They sat in that booth for 2 hours and 40 minutes. What emerged from the conversation was the kind of picture that you could only see when 2 separate perspectives collapsed into one, like 2 pieces of a map finally laid side by side. The full geography suddenly legible where before you'd only had fragments. Vittorio had been tracking Leonard Mercer's network from the financial side. He'd lost 2 men in the process, not killed, but burned, exposed, their covers blown in ways that suggested someone on the inside was feeding information to Mercer's people. He'd been working with reduced resources and a compressed timeline for 4 months. Elara had been tracking from the operational side, the infrastructure, the movement, the documentation. She had names and routes and 3 years of carefully built evidence. What neither of them had, separately, was the connection point. The man or men at the center who linked Leonard Mercer's money to the operations it was funding. Halfway through the second hour, Vittorio said a name she hadn't heard before. She made him repeat it. Then she opened her phone, pulled up a photograph from a surveillance file she'd built 8 months earlier, and turned the screen toward him. "Is this him?" Vittorio looked at the photograph. His jaw tightened, the first fully involuntary reaction she'd seen from him. "Where did you get this? Does it match?" "Yes." She turned the phone back around. "He attended 3 events at the Mercer Foundation in the last 2 years," she said. "I flagged him as a potential connection but couldn't establish the link. You just established it." Vittorio was quiet for a moment. Then, "He was also present at the meeting where my men were burned." She looked at him. "Then you have a leak." "I know I have a leak." A edge came into his voice, brief and sharp, before he controlled it. "I've been trying to find it for 4 months. How many people know the full scope of what you're building against Mercer?" 4. "Then it's one of 4 people." "Brilliant deduction," he said, and the dryness in it almost made her laugh. Almost. "Walk me through the 4, she said. He held her gaze for a moment, calculating. This was the part where trust required an actual decision, not a gesture, like arriving with one bodyguard, but the real thing, the information that could be used against you. She watched him make the decision. It took about 4 seconds. He walked her through the 4. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, "The second one, your financial coordinator." "Mira." "She has a brother," Elara said. "He works in logistics for a company that is, on paper, a freight operation based in Newark. That company's 3rd largest client is a Mercer shell entity." The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that came after something landed. "You've had her for how long?" Vittorio said, and his voice was very even. I didn't have her. I had the company. I connected her to it 18 minutes ago while you were talking." He looked at her. I run fast searches while I'm listening, she said. It's a habit. He sat back in his booth. He looked for the first time like a man who'd taken a hit he hadn't seen coming, not devastated, not undone, but recalibrating rapidly, the internal machinery working hard behind a face that barely showed it. 4 months, he said quietly. She's been inside for 4 months. Possibly longer. Possibly longer, he repeated. He said it flatly, the way you said something when you were processing the full shape of it and not yet ready to speak about the shape out loud. Elara gave him 30 seconds with it. Then she said, "We need to move faster than we planned." "Yes. And we need to do it without involving your existing team." He looked at her. "You're suggesting I shut out 3 loyal people because one of 4 is a leak. I'm suggesting you don't know which one until we verify, and until you verify the channel is compromised. All of it." She paused. "You know this. You've known it for 4 months. That's why you came to me." Another silence, longer this time. "What do you need?" he said. "Access to your Mercer financial files, everything you've built." "And in exchange?" "Everything I've built," she said, "plus the name of the man inside Leonard Mercer's operation who ordered the surveillance on my apartment 3 years ago." Vittorio's eyes sharpened. "You don't have that name." "I have everything except that name." "You have that name. I'm certain of it, because the man who ordered the surveillance on me is the same man who burned your people in Prague, and you would not have survived not knowing who that was." He was very still. "Am I wrong?" she said. "No," he said. "You're not wrong." "Then we have a deal." He picked up his tea. He'd ordered tea too, she'd noticed, and not drunk it either, and set it back down. "You're going to be difficult to work with." "Almost certainly," she said. She was 3 blocks from the restaurant when her phone vibrated. Not the main phone. The secondary one, the number that existed for exactly 2 contacts, both of whom had been instructed never to use it unless the situation was severe. She answered it in a doorway, her back to the building, watching the street. "Talk." The voice belonged to a woman named Sable, not her real name, but the only name she used professionally, who was one of the 2 partners Elara had built Vantage with. She was in the office. Her voice had a quality to it that Elara recognized immediately. The specific compression of someone who had information they needed to deliver and were choosing every word with extreme care. "Gideon Mercer was here," Sable said, 20 minutes ago. Elara said nothing. "He came in person, no assistant, no lawyer, just him. He said he needed to speak to the director of Vantage International regarding a security concern." A pause. "He didn't know it was you. He doesn't know it's you. I checked his face when I told him the director wasn't available. He had no idea." "What did he want?" "He said someone has been approaching his company's clients, offering to pull their security contracts with Mercer-affiliated firms and bring them to a competitor. He said 3 clients have left in the last 6 weeks, and he believes it's coordinated." Elara stood in the doorway and looked at the traffic moving on the street and breathed steadily. "Did he give you the competitor's name?" "No, but he left a card and said he'd like a call back. Don't call him back." "Understood." Sable paused again. "Elara." He looked... She stopped. "What?" He looked rough. Not crisis rough. Tired rough. Like someone who hasn't slept clean in a while. "That's not my problem," Elara said. "No," Sable agreed. "It isn't." She hung up and stood in the doorway for a moment longer than she needed to. The clients leaving Gideon's company weren't going to a competitor. They were coming to Vantage. 3 in 6 weeks, 2 more in conversation. She hadn't planned for Gideon to notice this quickly. She'd calculated another 2 months before the pattern became visible to him. He was sharper than she'd given him credit for, even now. Now, she started walking. The meeting she hadn't planned for happened 4 days later. She was coming out of a building in Midtown, a client on the 14th floor who'd needed a full security audit after a breach that had been embarrassing rather than catastrophic. When she turned toward the elevator bank and found Gideon Mercer standing 20 feet away, he saw her at exactly the same moment she saw him. Neither of them moved for 2 full seconds. He looked the way Sable had described, tired in the specific way of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for long enough that they'd stopped noticing the weight until something reminded them. He was in a good suit, well pressed. His hair was shorter than it had been. His face had a sharpness to it that was new, or maybe it had always been there and she'd stopped looking for it. He spoke first. Elara. Gideon. He walked toward her. She stayed where she was because moving would have looked like retreat, and she didn't retreat. You look... He stopped. Started again. I didn't know you were working in this building. I have a client here, she said. Her voice was level. She was very aware of every muscle in her face. I have a client here too, he said. 15th floor. His eyes moved over her. The suit, the briefcase, the posture, and she could see him recalibrating, the same way Vittorio had, except Vittorio had adjusted quickly and cleanly, and Gideon looked like a man whose footing had been pulled out from under him. You're in private security, he said. Yes. How long? A while. He was quiet for a moment. The elevator opened behind him, and two people got out and moved past them without looking up. The lobby sounds filled the space between them. Footsteps, phone calls, the low mechanical breath of a building doing its business. I went to a firm called Vantage last week, he said. Did you know that? No, she said, which was technically true. She hadn't known he would go personally. Whoever runs it has been pulling clients away from my company. He watched her face. He'd always been reasonably good at watching faces, which was one of the things that had initially interested her about him, years ago, before she understood that his skill at reading people had a crucial blind spot. He could read what was there, but he consistently underestimated what wasn't. That sounds like a business problem, she said. It sounds like something coordinated. He took one step closer. Not aggressive, careful, like someone approaching a conversation they weren't sure would go well and wanted to manage the variables. Elara, I know we didn't end well. She said nothing. I know that's an understatement. He ran a hand through his hair. The gesture was unchanged, exactly as she remembered it, something he did when he was working toward something he didn't know how to say. I made choices that were wrong. I know that. I'm not here to... This isn't me trying to... He stopped. Are you the one doing this? She looked at him. Are you behind Vantage, he said. Why would I be behind a security firm pulling your clients? Because you'd be good at it, he said. And there was something in his voice that was not accusation and was not quite admiration and was not quite either of those things. Something raw, something that had the sound of a man confronting a version of reality he'd refused for a long time. You were always good at things I didn't see. The elevator behind him opened again. She looked past him at it. I have to go, she said. Elara. She walked past him and stepped into the elevator and turned around. He was standing where she'd left him, watching her. His hands were at his sides. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like someone who didn't know what to do next. The doors closed. She stood in the elevator and looked at her own reflection in the brushed steel of the door, and waited for something to move in her chest, some residual thing, some old ache. It was there, small, heavier than she wanted it to be. She breathed through it. The elevator opened on the lobby. She walked out into the street. What Gideon did after that meeting was the thing she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected him to hire someone, to investigate Vantage, to start pulling threads the way he always pulled threads when he felt challenged, systematically, thoroughly, with the focused intensity that had made him genuinely good at the parts of his business that didn't involve other people. What she hadn't expected was for him to pull the specific thread that he pulled. He went to his father. She knew this because Vittorio's surveillance on Leonard Mercer's office was considerably more comprehensive than Gideon would have imagined possible, and the conversation between father and son that happened 3 days after the lobby encounter was captured in enough detail to be transcribed. She read the transcript on a Thursday morning in her office, alone, the door closed. Gideon had gone to his father to ask about Vantage International. He described the client defections. He described the firm's apparent capabilities. He'd been, from the transcript, genuinely confused, trying to understand what was happening to his business. Leonard Mercer's response was the part that changed everything. He hadn't asked questions. He hadn't expressed concern. He'd said very quietly, "Give me the director's name." Gideon had said he didn't have it. The firm was discreet. Leonard had said, "Find it." And then, and this was the part that made her sit very still in her chair, Leonard had said, "If it's who I think it is, this isn't a business problem, Gideon. This is something else entirely, and you don't want to be anywhere near it." Gideon had said, "What does that mean?" Leonard had said, "It means do what I tell you." She read the transcript twice. Then she put it face down on her desk and picked up her phone. Vittorio answered in one ring. Did you see it? She said. I saw it. He knows who I am. Yes. Or he suspects closely enough that it doesn't matter. She was standing now without fully registering that she'd stood. He's been waiting for me to surface. That's what this is. He knew I didn't disappear. He knew I went under, and he's been waiting. How long have you known this was possible? I've known it was possible since Prague, she said. I didn't know he'd maintained active concern. I thought time had... She stopped. You thought he'd moved on, Vittorio said. I thought 3 years of silence meant the threat had diminished. Leonard Mercer doesn't diminish, Vittorio said. He waits. She put her free hand flat on the desk and looked at the surface, the legal pads, the files, the cold coffee, the evidence of years of careful work. He sent the surveillance team 3 years ago, she said. That wasn't paranoia about an operative. That was targeted. He knew specifically what I was doing, which means someone told him, Vittorio said. 3 years ago. Someone who knew what you were. The room was very quiet. The leak in your network, she said slowly. The person feeding information to Mercer. When did that start? A pause. She could hear Vittorio working through it on his end. I assumed it started when I began building the case against Mercer, 8-9 months ago. What if it didn't, she said. What if the leak is older? What if the same person who burned your people in Prague was also the person who told Leonard Mercer about me? Not recently, 3 years ago. Before my divorce, before Prague even. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. That would mean the leak isn't opportunistic, Vittorio said. His voice had gone very flat. It's embedded. Someone who has been inside both our operations simultaneously, for years, feeding information to Mercer the entire time. Yes. That changes the geometry of everything. Yes, she said. Elara. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not quite urgency, but close. If Mercer already knows who you are, and he knows you've been building evidence against him, then you're not waiting for the right moment anymore. You're already in the window. She knew what he meant by the window. It was the operational term for the span of time between when a threat was identified and when it acted. Once a target knew they were being closed in on, the window opened, and inside the window everything moved faster, less predictably, with more violence. How long do you think we have? She said. Days, he said. Not weeks. She stood at her desk in the quiet office and looked at the face-down transcript and understood, with the specific clarity that only came when all the variables collapsed into a single point, that the operation she'd spent 3 years building had just entered its final phase. Not on her timeline, on Leonard Mercer's. She had 2 choices. Accelerate everything she'd planned, compress it into a time frame it hadn't been designed for, and accept the risk that came with speed, or she could wait, hold her ground, let Mercer make the first move from a position where she understood his next step. She picked up the transcript, read it one more time. Leonard Mercer had told his son, "You don't want to be anywhere near it," which meant Gideon didn't know. Whatever his father was planning, Gideon wasn't part of it. She set the transcript down. That detail mattered. She didn't know yet exactly how it mattered, but it did. I need 48 hours, she told Vittorio. You have 24, he said. My surveillance picked up a second call. Mercer reached out to someone after Gideon left. We're still identifying the contact, but the nature of the call... He paused. It was operational, not informational. He's not investigating you. He's already moving. She looked at the window. The city outside was doing what it always did, blank and indifferent and relentless. Then we moved tonight, she said. They moved that night, but not in the way she'd planned. The original architecture of the operation had been built for patience, slow accumulation, careful placement, the kind of evidence gathering that would hold up not just in a courtroom, but against the specific legal strategies that a man with Leonard Mercer's resources could deploy. She'd designed it to be unassailable, redundant, built with enough structural depth that no single point of failure could collapse it. What she had not designed it for was speed. Speed introduced variables. Speed meant decisions made with incomplete information, contact points that hadn't been fully vetted, timing that depended on things holding together longer than stress tested. Speed meant exposure. But Leonard Mercer was already moving, and the window was open, and she did not have the luxury of the plan she'd wanted. She called Sable first. I need everything off-site within the hour. The primary files, the backup drives, the physical documentation in the third drawer. All of it. Sable didn't ask why. That was why she'd hired Sable. Where? The secondary location, not the one Vittorio's people know about. The other one. A beat of silence. Understood. Take the east exit and use the parking structure on Vine. Don't go directly. Elara. Sable's voice was measured, but tight. How bad? Bad enough that I'm not waiting to find out how bad. She hung up and called Vittorio next. I need your Mercer financial files transferred to an encrypted partition tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. I heard you the first time, he said. My people are already pulling them. Where do you want the handoff? Know where your people know. Send them to a courier. I'll give you a drop address. Another pause. Shorter this time. You don't trust my team. I trust you, she said. Your team has a leak. Those are not the same statement. Fair. She heard him moving, the background ambient sounds of a man who operated from multiple rooms simultaneously shifting as he changed locations. The drop address? She gave it to him. It was a storage unit in Queens she'd rented under a name that existed on 3 documents and nowhere else. A piece of infrastructure she'd built 18 months ago and never used, kept clean specifically for a moment like this. 2 hours, he said. 1.5. She was already in her car. The storage unit was cold and smelled of cardboard and old paint. She arrived 40 minutes after the call, checked the street 3 times before pulling in, and spent the next 20 minutes moving the contents of the lockbox she'd installed behind the ventilation panel into a hard-sided case she'd brought from the office. The case now contained the core of 3 years of work. Not everything. The full archive was distributed deliberately across 7 locations and 3 digital platforms with encryption that would take institutional resources to crack. But this was the operational spine, the evidence that connected Leonard Mercer's money to the infrastructure to the movement to the names. She was closing the latches when her phone buzzed. Not the secondary phone, the main one. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, but the prefix was one she recognized, a routing code she'd assigned to a specific contact years ago, a contact she'd classified as dormant. She answered it. Elara Voss, said a voice she hadn't heard in 4 years. Male, flat, American, the kind of voice that had been trained out of expressiveness so thoroughly that what remained sounded almost mechanical. She went very still. Crane. I need to see you tonight. Crane, the operational alias of a man she'd known only as an asset handler during the Dresdner operation, had not contacted her in 4 years. As far as she'd known, he'd moved on from that work entirely. Why? She said. Because what you're walking into tonight isn't what you think it is. A pause. And because the person who told Leonard Mercer about you 3 years ago wasn't inside Vittorio Kane's network. The cold in the storage unit seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Then who was it? She said. Meet me and I'll tell you. Another pause. Come alone. I'll know if you don't. She looked at the hard-sided case on the floor, at the ventilation panel she'd resealed, at the concrete walls of the storage unit pressing in from all sides. Where? She said. He chose a parking structure in Brooklyn, not because it was dramatic, but because it was practical. She understood that. She would have chosen the same kind of place herself. 5 levels. Open sides. Easy visibility in all directions. Multiple exits. No cameras on the 3rd level because she'd checked it 2 years ago for a different reason, and the gap had still been there when she'd checked again this afternoon out of habit. Crane was leaning against a support column when she arrived, exactly where the shadows started but didn't fully commit. He was older than she remembered, grayer, thinner through the face, but with the same quality of stillness that had characterized him when she'd known him. He looked like a man who had been very good at a very specific thing for a long time and was now carrying the weight of all of it. She kept 6 feet between them, old habit. You're looking well, he said. Talk, she said. He didn't flinch at the bluntness. He'd expected it. The Dresdner operation, he began. You were embedded for 7 months. You built a file on the network, documented the routes, identified the connection points. At the end of the operation, you submitted your findings through standard channels and withdrew to personal cover. I know what I did. What you don't know, he said, is what happened to those findings after you submitted them. She waited. They were reviewed by a handler above my clearance level, Crane said. Someone I didn't know personally, but whose name I knew. A senior figure in the private oversight structure that was running the operation. He reviewed your findings, identified the Mercer connection, and made a decision. What decision? Crane looked at her with something that was not quite apology and not quite pity, but had traces of both. He buried them. She didn't move. Say that again. Your findings were reviewed and deliberately suppressed, Crane said. Not lost. Not deprioritized. Buried. The Mercer connection was identified as too sensitive to pursue through standard channels because of existing relationships between the oversight structure and elements of the Mercer financial network. The concrete and the cold and the ambient noise of the city far below felt very far away. Who? She said. One word. No inflection. A man named Aldrich Voss. The name hit her somewhere beneath the ribs, a physical thing, and she understood in the half-second before she could construct a response exactly what it meant, and why Crane had driven her to a parking structure in Brooklyn to say it, and why he'd said come alone, and why his voice had had that specific quality of someone delivering something they had no other option but to deliver. Voss. Her operational surname, the name she'd chosen. He's your father, Crane said quietly. I know you know that. I'm saying it because I need you to hear the rest clearly without wondering if I know. She put her hand on the support column next to her. Not for support. She didn't need support. It was the gesture of a person establishing physical contact with something solid when the ground had shifted. My father has been in private security oversight for 30 years, she said. Her voice was even. She was very focused on keeping it even. He retired 6 years ago. He didn't retire, Crane said. He restructured. He moved out of institutional affiliation and into private consulting. And his primary consulting client, for the past 7 years, has been Leonard Mercer. The parking structure was very quiet. She could hear distantly the sound of a car on the level below. My father, she said slowly, suppressed my operational findings on Dresdner because they implicated his client. Yes. And then he told Leonard Mercer about me. He told Mercer that an operative had built a file on his network and was potentially embedded in his personal circle, Crane said. He didn't give your name. He gave enough information that Mercer's people were able to identify you within 6 months. The surveillance on my building, she said. Yes. 3 years ago. She was doing the math without meaning to, the way the brain did arithmetic when the rest of it was occupied with absorbing something too large to absorb quickly. I was still married to Gideon 3 years ago. The surveillance started while I was still inside the Mercer household. Yes. My father told Mercer's people to look for an operative embedded in his personal circle, she said, while I was still in that circle, while I was still his daughter-in-law. He didn't know it was you, Crane said. When he suppressed your findings, he didn't know you'd built a personal life inside the Mercer orbit. He found out later. When he found out, he stopped. When he found out, she said. He didn't pull the information back, Crane said. He let Mercer's people keep looking. She took her hand off the column. She turned and walked 2 steps away and stood with her back to him for approximately 4 seconds. She was breathing carefully, slow in, slow out, because the alternative was something she could not afford in a parking structure in Brooklyn with Crane 6 feet behind her. Her father had known Mercer's people were hunting her. He had let them. She turned back around. Why are you telling me this now? She said. Her voice was flat, completely flat. The emotion was there. She could feel it, a thing with pressure and heat, pushing against the inside of her chest. But her voice was under control. You've had this information for years. Why now? Crane looked at her steadily. Because 2 days ago, Aldrich Voss contacted Leonard Mercer and told him where you are. Not where Vantage is. Not a description of your operational identity. Your name. Your address. Your daily patterns. She absorbed this. He burned you completely, Crane said. I don't know why he moved now. Maybe he knew you were getting close. Maybe Mercer pushed him. But as of 48 hours ago, Leonard Mercer knows exactly who you are and exactly where to find you. You said Vittorio's leak wasn't inside his team, she said. It wasn't. My father, she said. He was feeding information to Mercer about Vittorio's operation too. He has been for 8 months, Crane said. He identified the connection between you and Kane and became the conduit. He is the reason Vittorio's people were burned in Prague. He is the reason the surveillance on you started. He is the reason... Crane stopped. His jaw tightened. He is the reason the night you disappeared from your marriage, there was a car parked outside your building with 2 men in it who were not there to watch. They were there to act. They were waiting for a signal. The sound of the city came up through the open sides of the parking structure. Wind, traffic, the low and indifferent grind of a place that didn't care what happened to anyone in particular. He gave the signal, she said. He didn't stop it, Crane said. She understood the distinction. Her father had not, technically, ordered her killed. He had simply declined to prevent it. She had survived because she'd spotted the car and moved before they could act. Not because anyone had intervened on her behalf. Not because her father had pulled the signal back. She'd survived on her own training, her own instincts, 3 years of operational discipline that had become as automatic as breathing. She had survived in spite of her father. She stood in the parking structure and let the full shape of it settle. It took longer than she wanted. She was good at processing difficult information. She'd trained herself to be. But there was a specific category of information for which no training was fully adequate. And finding out that your parent had allowed you to be targeted was that category. She breathed through it. Then she put it in the place where she put things she would have to deal with later, in the specific internal architecture she'd built over years for exactly this purpose. And she locked it there with the firmness of someone who understood that grief and operational necessity could not coexist in the same moment. Later. Vittorio doesn't know any of this, she said. No. I need to tell him tonight. Yes. Crane hesitated. Elara, your father is going to be at the Meridian Gala on Saturday. He's been on Mercer's guest list for 2 years. If Mercer moves before Saturday, he won't, she said. Mercer is theatrical. He waits for an audience. She thought of the transcript, of Leonard Mercer's flat voice telling his son this isn't a business problem. He'll want to handle me somewhere visible, somewhere that makes a point. The gala, Crane said. The gala, she confirmed. Then you have 3 days. I have 3 days, she said, to compress everything I built for 18 months into 72 hours, with a compromised asset chain, a father who has just burned every protective layer I had, and a target who knows I'm coming. Crane looked at her. Is it possible? She picked up her bag. Ask me in 3 days. She walked to the stairwell. At the door she stopped, her hand on the push bar, and said without turning around, How long have you known? About my father. A pause. Long enough to be honest. 2 years, Crane said. She pushed through the door and let it close behind her. She drove for 20 minutes without destination, which she never did. She always had a destination, because she needed the motion and the contained space of the car and the city moving past the windows while she constructed the new architecture of everything. The operation she'd built was compromised at its root. Not at the edges, not by Vittorio's leak or by Gideon's suspicions or by Leonard Mercer's surveillance, but at the root, which was the reason she'd been inside the Mercer household in the first place, which was the Dressner operation, which had been suppressed before it could achieve anything, which had been suppressed by her own father. 3 years of building on a foundation that had been cracked before she laid the first stone. She pulled over on a side street and sat with the engine running and her hands on the wheel and worked through the logical implications one at a time, not allowing herself to rush, because rushing was what you did when emotion was driving, and she could not afford that. The Dressner findings, suppressed, but she still had copies. She'd kept copies because she kept copies of everything, a habit that predated the Mercer operation by years. Those copies were part of the archive in the storage unit in Queens. If she could connect those findings to the current evidence, bridge the gap between what she'd documented in the Dressner operation and what she'd built in the 3 years since, she could construct a chain of evidence that didn't depend on the suppressed findings being validated. She could make them relevant retroactively. It was possible. It would be difficult. It required 3 days of work she hadn't planned to do and resources she would need to pull from contingencies she'd been holding back. She also needed to tell Vittorio about her father. She needed to tell him that the leak he'd been hunting for months was not inside his team at all, that it was a man who had been operating at a level above both of their operations simultaneously, feeding information in both directions, to both sides, for years. She needed to tell him that the person who had burned his people in Prague, the person who had ordered the surveillance on her building, the person who had provided Leonard Mercer with her identity 48 hours ago, was her father. She sat with that for a moment. Then she put the car in gear and drove. Vittorio opened the door of the townhouse himself. He'd known she was coming. She'd called from the road, said only that she had information that required in-person delivery, and he had responded by sending his security team to the perimeter and opening the door himself, which she registered as its own kind of statement. She walked in. He closed the door. They stood in the front hallway, a space that was understated and expensive in the way of someone who had money but no interest in announcing it, and she looked at him and said, without preamble, "I know who your leak is." He was very still. "It's not inside your team," she said. "It never was. The person feeding information to Mercer is a senior figure in the private oversight structure that originally ran the Dresdner operation. He's been consulting for Mercer for 7 years. He identified the connection between your operation and mine 8 months ago and became the conduit between both of us and Mercer's intelligence arm." Vittorio said, "Who?" She told him. The name meant something to him. She could see it, the recognition landing in his expression with the weight of something that had been half known and now became fully known. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You know him." "Yes." "How?" "He's my father." The hallway was very quiet. Vittorio looked at her, not with pity, not with calculation, but with the focused attention of a man who was completely inside what she'd just said and working through its implications in real time. He did not look away. He did not reach for the easy response. He held what she'd said and let it occupy the space it needed to occupy. "He burned you," Vittorio said finally, 48 hours ago. Mercer has my full identity. Then we're already inside the window." "Yes." He moved then, turned and walked into the room off the hallway, the one she'd identified on her first visit as his primary working space, and she followed. He went to the table where his files were spread, picked up a phone, made a call in under 10 seconds that she could tell from the terseness of it was an instruction to pull something immediately, and hung up. "The gala," he said. "Saturday. Mercer will move there. He'll want the audience." "My intelligence on the gala's security is compromised," she said. "Anything your team fed into the planning process, assume Mercer has it." His jaw tightened. Not fury, control exerting itself over something that wanted to be fury. "Then we go in blind." "No," she said. "We go in with what I have, what I built independently, through channels he doesn't know." She paused. "And we go in with one other thing." He looked at her. "Gideon?" she said. "No," he said immediately, flat. "Gideon doesn't know what his father is," she said. "The transcript proved that. Leonard told him to stay away from it. He kept him deliberately outside the circle. Which means Gideon is the one person in the Mercer orbit who is not compromised because they never trusted him with the truth. He's also the man who, I know what he is," she said. Her voice was sharp, sharper than she'd intended, and she made herself take a breath. "I know exactly what he did and what he failed to do and what it cost. I'm not asking you to trust him. I'm telling you that he has access to the gala. He has standing inside the Mercer network that neither of us has. And if he understood what his father has been doing, he would act." "You don't know that." "No," she admitted. "I don't know that. But I know him well enough to know that Gideon Mercer is not his father, and that the thing Leonard has been most careful to protect his son from is the truth about what the family money actually funds." She looked at Vittorio. "That knowledge will destroy Gideon's understanding of his entire life. And a man whose entire understanding of his life has just been destroyed is either useless or he becomes something else entirely." "Which do you think Gideon will be?" She thought of the lobby, of his hands at his sides, of the exhaustion in his face that wasn't the exhaustion of crisis, but of something longer and heavier and more private. "I think he'll become something else," she said. Vittorio looked at her for a long moment. "And if you're wrong?" "Then we lose the gala, and we fall back to the legal case, and we fight it out in courts for 2 years while Mercer's lawyers bury everything and his network keeps operating." She held his gaze. "I'm not wrong." He turned away and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she could see the tension across his shoulders, the physical evidence of a man deciding something he hadn't decided yet. "Contact Gideon." and he said finally, "but I want to be there when you do." She nodded. "And Elara?" He turned back to face her. His expression was carefully measured, but underneath the control there was something she hadn't seen there before. Something that looked like the specific concern of a person who had ceased to think of this as purely operational. "Your father will be at the gala." "I know." "That's going to be a problem for you." She looked at him steadily. "My father stopped being a problem I could afford to have the moment he gave Mercer my name." She picked up her bag. "He's a variable now. I know how to handle variables." She walked toward the door. She was 2 steps from the hallway when she heard Vittorio say quietly, "No one handles that cleanly. Not when it's family." She stopped. She didn't turn around. "No," she said. "They don't." She walked out into the night, and the city closed around her. And somewhere across the city, Leonard Mercer was making his plans for Saturday. And somewhere in a place she didn't have an address for, her father was doing whatever her father did. And Elara Voss stood on the sidewalk and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the woman who had walked into a storage unit in Queens 2 hours ago no longer existed. What replaced her was something colder and more focused and less interested in the careful, protective distance she'd kept between herself and the full force of what she was capable of. She had 3 days. She had a man who would be her enemy at the gala, and a man who might become an unexpected ally, and a father she was going to have to face in front of an audience of the city's most powerful people, without flinching, without breaking, without letting a single thing she felt show on her face. She started walking. The plan she'd built for 18 months was gone. What she built next would have to be something different entirely. She called Gideon at 7 in the morning, not from her main phone, from a number he wouldn't recognize because she needed him to answer without preparing himself, without the 3 seconds of emotional armor that her name on a caller ID would have given him. He answered on the second ring, voice rough with sleep. "Who is this?" "It's Elara," she said. Silence. The specific silence of a man who has been asleep and is now very suddenly not asleep. She heard him move, sheets, a creak of weight shifting, and then his breathing changed, steadied, and she could almost see him sitting up in the dark of whatever room he was in, pulling himself together. "How did you get this number?" he said. "I need to see you today," she said. "In person. Not at your office. Somewhere neutral." "It's 6:50 in the morning." "I know what time it is." Another silence. "Is this about the clients? About Vantage?" "It's about your father," she said. The silence that followed that was different in quality from the others, denser, more careful, the silence of someone who had just felt the ground shift slightly beneath them and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. "What about my father?" "Not on the phone," she said. "Today, noon. There's a diner on West 44th called Carver's, corner booth. Come alone." She hung up before he could say no. Vittorio was already at the secondary location when she arrived. A rented office space in a building that had no connection to Vantage, paid through a chain of entities that would take serious institutional resources to untangle, which she'd leased 8 months ago under the same name as the Queen's storage unit. He had 2 laptops open and a coffee that had gone cold, and the look of a man who had not slept but was operating on something beyond tiredness, the specific fuel that came when the situation was acute enough to override everything else. He looked up when she came in. "You called him." "This morning." "He'll come?" "He'll come because he's been trying to understand what's happening to his life for 2 weeks, and this is the first person who's offered him a real answer." She set down her bag and pulled off her jacket and sat across from him. "What do you have?" He turned one of the laptops toward her. "The financial coordinator, Mira, is in the wind. She left her apartment yesterday evening. We have a 20-minute window before her movement goes dark." He tapped the screen. "She made 1 call before she disappeared, 14 seconds, to a number that routes through 3 relay points and lands on a cell tower in the Mercer building's immediate vicinity. She knew we'd identified her." "Yes." "Which means Mercer knows we burned his source. Which means his timeline for Saturday compresses," Vittorio said. "He won't wait for the full gala now. He'll move earlier in the evening, before we can set anything up." Elara looked at the screen. Her mind was running parallel tracks. The logistics of Saturday, the meeting with Gideon at noon, the evidence chain she'd been reconstructing since 3 in the morning, and underneath all of it, persistent and unwanted, the fact of her father. The fact that her father was going to be in the same building on Saturday evening. that she was going to have to look at him. She pushed that track to the back. "What's our security situation for the gala?" she said. "Starting from zero," Vittorio said. "Everything we fed into the advanced planning is compromised. I have 3 people I can bring in who have zero connection to the prior operation, people Mercer's intelligence arm wouldn't know to look for. That's it. 3 people and us," she said. 3 people and us, he confirmed. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Then we don't play security," she said. "We can't win that way, not against a team that's been planning this for longer and has home field advantage inside the building. We play information, we go in with the evidence, and we go public with it before Mercer can make his move." In the middle of the gala, 500 people, every significant power player in the city. Half of them are Mercer clients or Mercer associates, which means half of them are also people who will be implicated when the evidence goes public and will spend the rest of the evening calculating whether to distance themselves or dig in. She paused. "And we need it on record. Video, streamed in real time, so there's no version of events that gets revised afterward." Vittorio looked at her. "You're going to walk into the Meridian Gala and publicly detonate a man with Leonard Mercer's resources and connections in front of his entire network. Yes, and you want Gideon's help to do it." "I need his access credentials for the Mercer Foundation systems," she said. "He has administrator-level access from his board position. With those credentials, I can push the evidence package to every screen in the venue simultaneously. Every monitor, every presentation display, the main projection wall in the ballroom." She looked at Vittorio steadily. "It needs to be impossible to look away from." Vittorio was quiet for a moment. "And if Gideon won't give you the credentials, then we find another way," she said. "But he will." "You keep saying that." "Because I know him," she said, with a sharpness she hadn't intended. She took a breath. "I know him," she repeated more evenly. "Not the man I thought I married, and not the man his father made him. The actual man. I spent 6 years in close proximity to Gideon Mercer, and I made the mistake of misreading him in one specific direction, but I did not misread his character entirely. He is not his father." Vittorio held her gaze. "You're going to need to be right about that." "I know," she said. Gideon was at Carver's when she arrived. He'd gotten there early. She could tell from the way the coffee cup in front of him was already half empty, which meant he'd been sitting there long enough to drink half a cup of bad diner coffee, which meant he'd left wherever he was sleeping as soon as she'd hung up and driven here and sat with his thoughts for the better part of an hour. He looked up when she walked in. His face did something complicated and then went neutral. She slid into the booth across from him. He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way that was different from the lobby encounter, less shocked and more deliberate, and said, "Vantage International is yours." "Yes," she said. "How long?" 3 years. "You built it after the divorce." "I built it before the divorce," she said. "I just didn't open the doors until after." Something moved through his expression. Not anger. Something more like the specific exhaustion of a man who has been recalculating for a long time and just had to recalculate again. "You were always going to leave." "That's not what happened," she said. "And it's not why I'm here. I need you to listen to me for the next 10 minutes without interrupting, and then I need you to make a decision." His jaw tightened, but he picked up his coffee and held it and looked at her and nodded once. She told him. Not everything. Not her operational history, not Prague, not the full architecture of what she'd built against his family's network. She told him what he needed to know to make the decision she needed him to make. She told him about the transportation network, about the infrastructure, about what the Mercer financial empire had been funding. She kept her voice even and her eyes on his face, and she watched him closely as each piece of information landed. He held it together through the first 3 minutes. His hands were steady. His face was controlled. He was listening the way he listened when something was important, with the focused attention of someone who understood that he was receiving information he couldn't unreceive and was choosing to receive it anyway. Then she told him about the night she'd left, about the car outside the building, about what the men inside it had been waiting for. His hands changed on the coffee cup, a small thing. His knuckles didn't go white, he was too controlled for that, but the pressure shifted, and she saw his fingers tighten by degrees, slow and involuntary, the body's response to something the mind was trying not to respond to. "My father," he said. His voice was flat in the specific way of someone maintaining flatness through effort. Yes. He knew people were watching you. He knew more than that, she said. She looked at him. Gideon. He knew what they were there to do. The booth was very quiet. Outside, the diner went on being a diner. Coffee, clatter, the low conversation of the morning crowd, the indifferent machinery of a place that served breakfast to people who had ordinary problems. He wouldn't, Gideon started. He did, she said. Not harshly, just clearly. I'm not asking you to believe it because I'm telling you. I'm asking you to look at what I'm going to show you and tell me what you see. She opened her phone and placed it on the table between them. The financial records, the shell company chains, the routing structures, the evidence of what the Mercer network had been funding, not abstractly, not theoretically, but with names and dates and amounts and destinations. Gideon looked at it for a long time. She watched his face. The controlled flatness began to fracture, not dramatically, not in the way of a man breaking down, but in the way of a structure under load showing the first fine cracks. His breathing changed, became shallower. He set down the coffee cup because his hands needed somewhere to go and there was nowhere for them to go, so he put them flat on the table. How long? He said. 7 years that I can document, she said. Possibly longer. 7. He stopped. The foundation. The Mercer Foundation. The charitable. The foundation is clean, she said. Your philanthropic work is not part of this. Your legitimate business interests are not part of this. This is your father's private network, and it runs parallel to everything you built, and he kept it away from you deliberately. Why? His voice cracked on the word. Not emotionally, physically, the voice of a man whose throat had constricted. Why would he keep it from me? Because he needed you clean, she said. He needed a legitimate public face for the Mercer name. You were that face. You were always that face. Gideon looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not in 6 years of marriage, not in the lobby, not at any point in their history together. It was the expression of a man who has just understood something about his own life that cannot be understood from within the life, that requires an outside view, a distance he has never had, and that the distance has arrived all at once and without mercy. You knew, he said quietly, when we were married. You knew about this. I was building evidence, she said. I didn't have the full picture yet. I was getting there. You married me to... He stopped. No, she said, and her voice was firm. I married you because I made a choice I was warned against. That choice was personal, and it was mine, and it complicated everything, but it was not operational. Do you understand me? He looked at her for a long moment. Do you understand me? She repeated. Yes, he said, barely audible. Then I need you to understand what I'm asking you to do, she said. Saturday, the Meridian Gala. Your father is going to try to handle me publicly. He knows who I am now, he knows what I've built, and he's going to try to dismantle it in front of his entire network. She paused. Unless we get there first. Unless we put the evidence in front of those 500 people before he can control the room. You want my credentials, he said. He'd gotten there fast. He was, she had always known, quick. Administrator access to the Mercer Foundation presentation systems. You have it from your board position. With it, I can push the evidence package to every display in the venue simultaneously. And then what? He said. My father gets arrested and his network collapses and he stopped. And my family is destroyed. Your family's criminal infrastructure is destroyed, she said. What you choose to build after that is yours. He sat with that. The diner clattered and breathed around them. My mother, he said, is not implicated in any of the evidence I have. She doesn't know. I don't believe she does, no. He looked down at the phone on the table, at the records still visible on the screen. He looked at them for a long time, and she let him look, because rushing this moment would break something that she needed intact. Then he picked up his own phone, opened an app, entered credentials. She watched him type with the care of someone giving something away they knew they couldn't get back. He turned the phone toward her. Administrator access. Every display in the Meridian venue. Full push capability. Saturday, he said. Saturday, she confirmed. He looked at her. One more time, that complicated look. The look of a man who had 10 different things to say and knew that none of them were the right thing yet. Were you ever... He stopped, started differently. The 6 years. Is any of it? Yes, she said. Some of it. She picked up the phone and stood up. Elara, he said. She looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. For the divorce. For the way for all of it. She looked at him for a moment. Survive Saturday, she said. Then we can talk about the rest of it. She walked out of the diner. Saturday arrived the way that days with consequences arrived, looking, on the surface, exactly like any other day. Cold morning light, traffic, the city indifferent and grinding. But underneath that surface, the specific pressure of a day that had been building for 3 years. The Meridian was a landmark property in Midtown, a converted historical building that had hosted galas for 4 decades, its ballroom capable of holding 700 in the configuration used for the Mercer Foundation's annual event. Tonight's event had 540 confirmed guests, politicians, executives, finance figures, civic leaders, old money and new money, and the money that preferred not to be named. Leonard Mercer would arrive at 8. Elara arrived at 5:30 through a service entrance that Vittorio's advance person had unlocked 45 minutes earlier. She was wearing the black dress she'd bought for this specific night 6 months ago when she'd first identified the gala as the endpoint, and she was carrying the hard-sided case from the Queen's storage unit, and her heart rate was 58 beats per minute, which was 2 above her resting rate, and the most she was going to give this night in terms of visible response. Vittorio came in through the same entrance 30 seconds behind her. He looked at her. Ready. Ready, she said. They moved. The technical setup took 40 minutes. She worked fast and without speaking, her hands moving through the venue's AV infrastructure with the focused efficiency of someone who'd studied the system schematics for 2 weeks and knew exactly what she was touching and why. Vittorio positioned himself at the ballroom entrance and watched the room fill up behind her as guests began arriving. Earlier than expected, the energy in the building already elevated, the particular social electricity of 500 powerful people in a room that was about to matter. She was in the AV booth at the back of the ballroom when her secondary phone buzzed. Sable. 1 word. He's here. Elara looked at the time, 7:43. Leonard Mercer was 17 minutes early. She texted back. Gideon? 3 seconds. Arrived 2 minutes ago. East entrance. She looked across the ballroom, through the filling crowd, through the glassware and the event lighting and the movement of 500 people assembling themselves into the social architecture of a powerful evening, and found Gideon almost immediately. He was standing near the east wall, alone, with a drink he wasn't touching, wearing the specific expression of a man holding himself together by the thinnest possible margin. Her phone buzzed again. Vittorio. Mercer is moving through the room. He's got 4 men with him positioned at the exits. She typed back. How long before he gets to the stage? Vittorio. 20 minutes. Maybe less. He's working the room, but he's moving with purpose. 20 minutes. She needed 22. She turned back to the AV system and pushed harder. She was 3 minutes from ready when she heard the voice behind her. I wondered if you'd actually come. She turned around. Her father was standing in the doorway of the AV booth. Aldrich Voss was 63 years old and looked younger than that, lean, gray-haired, with the posture of someone who had spent decades in physical discipline and the eyes of someone who had spent just as long in the other kind. He was wearing a dark suit, and he was standing with his hands at his sides, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could not, even now, fully read. She had her father's eyes. She'd always known that, had been told it her entire life. Looking at him was, in some technical sense, looking at a version of herself 40 years forward. You should have stayed gone, he said. You should have pulled the signal, she said. The words landed. She watched them land. Whatever she'd expected, denial, explanation, some construction of justification. What she got instead was the specific stillness of a man who had known this moment was coming and had not found a way to prepare for it. I couldn't, he said. Couldn't or didn't. They would have gone after me instead, he said. If I'd interfered, if I'd pulled the signal or warned you or given you any indication, Mercer's people would have identified me as compromised and I would have been, he stopped. Killed, she said. Yes. So you let them come after me instead. He looked at her. You were trained, he said. You knew how to survive. I calculated. Don't, she said. Her voice came out harder than she intended, with an edge that surprised even her. Don't tell me what you calculated. Don't make it a variable. I was your daughter, and you let them come for me, and I want you to say that without the math around it. His jaw moved. Something worked in his face. She could see the machinery of it, the effort of a man who had spent 60 years thinking in terms of calculations and contingencies, being asked to step outside that structure and say a plain thing plainly. I let them come for you, he said quietly, and I have not. He stopped. I have not done well with that. No, she said. You haven't. Her phone buzzed. Vittorio. Mercer is at the stage steps. 10 minutes. She turned back to the system. Her hands were moving before she'd fully made the decision to move them, operating on the automatic authority of 3 years of preparation. What are you doing? Her father said. What I came here to do. Elara. His voice changed, sharper, with an urgency that cut through the careful register he'd been maintaining. If you push that evidence tonight, Mercer's men will. I know what they'll do, she said. That's why Vittorio's team is positioned where they are, and why Gideon is standing by the east wall, and why I've been building this for 3 years. She did not look away from the screen. Get out of the booth. I can't let you. Get out of the booth, she said again. Her voice was absolutely flat. Or I will make what you did part of what goes on these screens tonight, and every person in that room will know your name by midnight. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Then she heard him step back. Then she heard the door close. She breathed through her nose, in, out. Her hands did not shake. She made sure of that. She checked herself with the coldness of a technician calibrating an instrument and found her hands steady and her pulse at 61 and her vision clear. She went back to work. Leonard Mercer took the stage at 8:04. She watched him through the narrow window of the AV booth. Silver-haired, commanding, moving through the ballroom with the ease of a man who had spent 40 years building rooms that responded to his presence. He was smiling. He shook 3 hands on the way to the stage steps. He was, by every visible measure, a man entirely in control of his evening. He reached the podium. He looked out at the assembled crowd. And then, before he could speak, before he could open what she'd calculated would be a 2-minute prepared introduction, followed by a 6-minute reveal that he'd been constructing for a week. The reveal that would put her name and her identity and 3 years of her work in front of 500 people framed as something criminal, something threatening, something requiring their collective response. She pushed the evidence package. Every monitor in the Meridian Ballroom lit up simultaneously. The main projection wall behind Leonard Mercer, 40 feet wide, floor to ceiling, filled with the first page of the financial documentation. Shell company structures, money flows, destination accounts, names. The crowd responded the way crowds responded when something catastrophic happened without warning in a room full of people who were not used to catastrophe. A wave of sound that wasn't quite words, wasn't quite silence, that moved from the front of the room to the back in under 3 seconds. Leonard Mercer turned around and looked at the wall behind him. She was already moving. She came out of the AV booth and through the service corridor and emerged into the ballroom through the side door and walked toward the stage. And the crowd parted because she was moving with the specific purpose of someone who had somewhere to be, and the crowd could feel it. Vittorio stepped out from the far side of the room and moved toward the stage from the opposite angle. Mercer saw her. Their eyes met across the room, across 500 people and 40 feet of evidence projected behind him. And she watched his face do the calculation. How bad, how fast, how contained. He reached into his jacket, not for a phone, for something else. But Gideon was already moving from the east wall, faster than she'd expected, crossing the space between them with the urgency of a man who had made his decision and was now committed to it in the way that people who had waited too long to make decisions committed to them, completely, with the full force of everything that had been held back. He stepped between his father and the stage's edge. Father and son looked at each other. Leonard Mercer said very quietly, "Don't." Gideon looked at his father for a long moment, his jaw set, his shoulders rigid, the full weight of everything he'd learned in a Brooklyn diner 3 days ago visible in his face, and said, "It's over, Dad." And then Vittorio was at the stage, and Elara was 3 feet from Leonard Mercer, and the room was a controlled detonation of sound and movement, and 500 people processing 500 different versions of what they were looking at. Leonard Mercer looked at Elara. "You were never going to stay buried," he said. He said it without visible anger, without panic, the observation of a man accepting an outcome he'd gambled against. "No," she said. "I wasn't. What happens now is going to be very ugly," he said. "I know," she said. "That's not my problem." Behind her, she heard the sound of the side doors opening, the specific acoustic signature of multiple people entering a room simultaneously, and without turning around, she knew it was the people she'd arranged to have waiting, the people with the authority to make this night permanent rather than dramatic. Leonard Mercer's eyes moved past her to the doors. For the first time in the evening, his expression changed. She turned around then, finally, and looked at the room, at the projection wall still running behind the podium, at Vittorio beside her, at Gideon standing 3 feet from his father with his hands at his sides, at 500 faces turning toward 500 different calculations about what this night was going to cost them, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief. Something simpler and harder and more complicated than either. She had 3 years of work on 40 feet of wall behind the most powerful man in the room, and his network was crumbling in real time, and the people who'd been waiting to act had the room, and she was still standing. But her father was somewhere in the building, and she hadn't looked at him since she'd told him to leave the booth. And the night was not over, and the thing she'd locked away in the parking structure in Brooklyn was still locked away, still pressing, still waiting for a moment she hadn't allowed it yet, one thing at a time. Leonard Mercer was looking at the people coming through the doors. His hand was still inside his jacket, and Gideon said very quietly from 3 feet away, "Don't make it worse than it already is." Leonard looked at his son. Something passed between them, something private and freighted and belonging to a relationship she'd never been fully inside. And then Leonard Mercer slowly removed his hand from his jacket, empty, and placed it at his side. But from the back of the room, from somewhere in the crowd that was now in controlled motion, a sound cut through the noise of 500 voices, sharp, purposeful, the sound of something being forced, and Vittorio's hand closed on her arm and pulled her sideways hard and fast in the same instant that the lights in the Meridian Ballroom went out. Complete dark. The sound of the crowd changed immediately, surprise becoming alarm, becoming the specific ugly edge of genuine fear. And in the dark, Elara felt Vittorio's grip on her arm and heard his voice directly in her ear, low and fast and absolutely controlled. "They cut the power. Mercer has a second team in the building." She reached into the side of her dress for the phone she'd taped there 3 hours ago and turned on its light and found Vittorio's face 6 inches from hers, and behind him the dark ballroom full of moving shapes and rising voices, and behind all of it the knowledge that the night had just shifted again, and not in her direction. "The evidence package," she said. "Already transmitted off-site before the power cut," he said. "It's out. It can't be pulled back." "Then the building is theater," she said. "He's not trying to stop the evidence. He's trying to stop you," Vittorio said. "Get to the east exit." She was already moving. The east exit was blocked. She knew it before she reached it. The specific quality of shadow at the end of the corridor told her, the way 2 shapes held too still against the wall to be guests who'd stumbled out of the darkened ballroom looking for an exit. She pulled up short and flattened against the wall, and felt Vittorio do the same behind her, his hand finding her shoulder in the dark, with the precision of someone who'd operated in worse conditions than this. She held up 2 fingers without looking back at him. He squeezed her shoulder once. Understood. The phone light was off. She'd killed it 30 seconds after leaving the ballroom, because light in a dark corridor was a target, and she was done being a target tonight. She moved on memory and instinct and the floor plan she'd studied until it was as familiar as her own apartment. 40 feet to the east exit, a service corridor branching left at the 20-foot mark, a stairwell at the end of the service corridor that opened into the building's basement loading dock. She turned left. The 2 men at the east exit heard the movement. She heard one of them shift, heard the sound of a hand touching a wall for orientation. But she was already into the service corridor and moving fast, her heels off within 3 steps because she'd worn ones she could remove quickly, and she'd known from the moment she'd put them on that this was a night that would require it. Vittorio was 2 feet behind her, silent, his breathing controlled in the way of someone who'd done this before, not as exercise, but as necessity. The stairwell door was unlocked. She'd made sure of that 6 hours ago. She pushed through it, took the stairs down fast, emerged into the loading dock with the cold air of the basement hitting her face and the ambient sound of the city filtering in through the dock's heavy doors, and stopped. Her father was standing at the bottom of the stairs, not positioned, not waiting with intent, not part of Mercer's second team. He was standing the way someone stood when they'd made a decision to be somewhere, and the decision had cost them something, his hands at his sides, his face in the low light of the dock showing the lines of a man who was 63 and carrying 63 years of choices that had compounded in ways he hadn't predicted. Vittorio stopped one step above her. She could feel the heat of him behind her shoulder, and she could feel him making the calculation, threat or not. And she put her hand back, flat, the signal for hold. "There's a car," her father said, "at the south dock door, a black SUV. The driver is mine, not Mercer's. He doesn't know about you." He looked at her. "The second team is covering the east and west exits and the main lobby. They're not covering the south dock because Mercer didn't tell them about the south dock because Mercer didn't know I knew about it." She stared at him. "I've been inside his operation for 7 years," her father said. "I know things about his building access that aren't in any brief his security team has. The south dock is a delivery entrance that was added 18 months ago as part of a renovation. It's not on the original building plans that his security team worked from." "You're helping us," she said. She said it the way you said something when the words themselves seemed to resist being said. "I'm helping you," he said. "Not him." He did not look at Vittorio. He kept his eyes on her face. The basement was cold and smelled of concrete and the exhaust of the city. Somewhere above them, the Meridian Ballroom was in controlled chaos, 500 people moving in the dark. Mercer's second team trying to locate a specific woman in the confusion, and the evidence package running on every server it had been transmitted to. Irretrievable, permanent. "The south dock," she said. "Yes." "And then what?" she said. "You helped me get out of the building and we're square? Is that what you think this is?" "No," he said quietly. "I don't think that." "Then what do you think it is?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen there before, hadn't seen in all the years of knowing him, which was the specific look of a man who had stopped calculating and was simply present in a moment that he'd been avoiding for a very long time. "I think it's too late to fix," he said, "and I think you know that. And I think the south dock is the only thing I have left to give you that's worth anything." The silence in the loading dock held for 3 seconds. Then she walked past him toward the south dock door. She didn't touch him as she passed, but she didn't move wide of him either. She passed close enough that her arm was within inches of his, and she heard his breath catch slightly, and then steady, and she kept walking. Vittorio followed. At the south dock door, she paused with her hand on the release bar and said, without turning around, "Aldrich." Behind her, her father was still standing at the bottom of the stairs. "Yes." "The man you consulted for," she said. "The man whose network funded what it funded. You're going to give a full account. Everything you know, everyone you know, every transaction and contact and communication for 7 years. To the right people. Not Mercer's lawyers, the right people." A pause. "And everything I know about your involvement goes into the public record along with Leonard Mercer's." She pushed the release bar. Cold air poured in from outside. "But I think you will. Because I think you've been trying to find a way out of this for longer than you'd admit. And this is the door." She stepped through into the night. The black SUV was exactly where her father had said it would be. The driver was a man she didn't know, middle-aged, with the look of someone who did professional driving and asked no questions. He looked at her and at Vittorio and started the engine without a word. She got in. Vittorio got in. The SUV pulled out of the south dock and turned into the city's indifferent traffic, and she sat in the back seat and watched the Meridian building shrink in the rear window, its lit windows and its stone facade, and the distant flicker of phone lights moving through the main entrance as guests poured out into the street, and she breathed for the first time in what felt like hours. Her pulse was 64. Vittorio was beside her, his elbow close to hers, looking at the same rear window. He didn't speak for a block and a half, which was the right call, because she needed a block and a half of silence. Then he said, "The evidence package is confirmed distributed. Sable sent confirmation 4 minutes ago. 12 recipients, all pre-designated, all received before the power cut." Good. The financial records, the shell company documentation, the routing structures. He paused. And the Dresdner findings. Your original operational report. She looked at him. You included them, he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was the observation of a man confirming something he'd noticed and was choosing to address carefully. They were always part of it, she said. The Dresdner findings are what started everything. They need to be part of the record. Your father's name is in them, he said. I know. He looked at her. You included them anyway. I told him what was coming, she said. That was what the loading dock was. I gave him the choice. He knows the findings are out there. What he does next is his. Vittorio was quiet for a moment. That was more than he gave you. Yes, she said. It was. She turned away from the rear window. The meridian was gone from view now, swallowed by the city's blocks and its relentless geometry. Ahead, the street opened into the broader avenue, traffic moving in both directions, the city doing what it always did regardless of what any specific person inside it was surviving. She was very tired. Not the tired of insufficient sleep, she'd operated on far less. The tired of a thing that had been held tightly for a very long time being, slowly, released. Leonard Mercer was taken into custody at 11:47 that night in the east corridor of the Meridian building by people with the appropriate authority who had been provided the appropriate evidence and had spent the appropriate amount of time verifying it before acting. He did not resist. He was, by every account she received in the days following, remarkably composed about it. The composure of a man who had known this outcome was possible and had made his calculations about it years ago and found the calculation, on balance, acceptable given what it had bought him. The second team he'd positioned in the building dispersed when the lights came back on, and the scope of the evening became clear. 3 of them were identified and subsequently located. 1 was not. She noted this and filed it in the appropriate mental category and moved on. Mira, Vittorio's financial coordinator who'd gone into the wind 2 days earlier, was found in Newark 48 hours after the gala, in an apartment connected to the freight company whose third largest client was the Mercer shell entity. She cooperated fully, because cooperation was the clearly correct option, and she was smart enough to see that quickly. The cooperation produced 4 additional names in the Mercer network that Elara hadn't had. She added them to the package that was already in the hands of the right people and considered the accounting, on that front, essentially complete. Gideon resigned from the Mercer Foundation Board 11 days after the gala, in a letter that was brief and without drama, and that acknowledged the board's need for leadership uncomplicated by the current situation. She read about it in a news summary Sable sent her each morning. She read it twice and then moved on to the next item. The conversation she had been putting off happened on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the gala, in a coffee shop in the West Village that she'd chosen because it was quiet and small and had good light, and she wanted good light for this particular conversation. Gideon came in at exactly the agreed time. He looked different, not dramatically different, not the face of a man transformed in some clean, resolved way, because people didn't transform cleanly, and she didn't believe in clean transformations. But different in the way of someone who'd put down a very heavy thing and was still adjusting to the new distribution of weight. His shoulders sat differently. His eyes were tired, but not in the way she'd seen in the lobby. That had been the tired of something unresolved. This was the tired of something that had resolved and left its marks. He sat down. She had coffee in front of her. He ordered the same. They sat for a moment without speaking, which was less uncomfortable than she'd have predicted. My mother is in Connecticut, he said, with her sister. He paused. She's handling it in the way that people handle things they can't quite fully believe yet. She'll be all right, eventually. I'm glad, Elara said. And she was. Constance Mercer was many things, not all of them warm, but she had not known, and not knowing deserved a certain kind of grace. The company, Gideon said, what's left of it after the asset freezes, there's a core that's legitimate, the properties, the development projects, the work I actually built myself without his money underneath it. He looked at his coffee. It's smaller than what I thought I had, but it's actually mine. That's not nothing, she said. No, he agreed. It's not nothing. He looked up at her. Your father, she held his gaze. He contacted the authorities 2 days after the gala, Gideon said. I still have some information channels that work. He gave a full account. He paused. 7 years of it. I know, she said. Will that be... He stopped. Started differently. What happens to him? That's not mine to decide, she said. He made the choices he made and he gave what account he could give. What follows is institutional, not personal. Gideon nodded slowly. He understood institutional. He was going to be living with institutional consequences himself for the foreseeable future, and he'd made his peace with that, or was in the process of making it. I owe you an honest accounting, he said, of the divorce, of what I knew and didn't know. You don't owe me. Let me say it, he said, not loudly, firmly. I knew my father's network had concerns about you. He didn't tell me what the concerns were. He told me there were people in his business circles who found your background unclear and that it was creating complications for him professionally. He looked at her steadily. I told myself it was his paranoia. He was always protective of the family name. I used that to make it smaller than it was. She listened. I convinced myself that divorcing you was about us, he said, about growing apart, about compatibility, all the things I told myself. Some of it was even true. But underneath it, I knew my father wanted you gone, and I made it happen, and I told myself a story about why that let me not look at what I was actually doing. He picked up the coffee. I used you as a sacrifice and called it a personal decision. The coffee shop was quiet around them, the low conversation of mid-morning, the sound of an espresso machine, the ordinary friction of a city getting through its Wednesday. I know, she said. I know you know, he said. I'm saying it because I want you to have heard it from me directly. Not implied, not worked around. He looked at her. I'm sorry, Elara, for the specific thing I did, not the general fact of it. She looked at him for a long moment. I made my own choices, she said. I chose to stay in that marriage longer than I should have. Not because I was trapped, because I wanted it to work. And I let that want override my judgment, and that's mine. She paused. We both did things the other one deserved better from. Something in his face relaxed slightly. Not relief exactly, but the specific easing of tension that came when something you'd been carrying was acknowledged as shared weight rather than assigned entirely to one side. What are you going to do now? He asked. Work, she said. Vantage has 3 new clients from the past 2 weeks alone. Apparently publicly detonating a criminal network at a charity gala is good for the security consultation business. He almost laughed. Almost. That tracks. She finished her coffee. She was about to stand when he said, The man who knelt. She looked at him. At the gala, he said. Before the lights went out. I saw Kane cross the room to you. He paused. He moved like it was the most important thing in that room. And it wasn't, strategically. Strategically, he should have stayed at his position. He was coming to help me manage Mercer, she said. He wasn't, Gideon said. Not accusatory, just clear. He was coming to you. There's a difference. She didn't answer that. I'm not, Gideon said, and stopped and started again. I'm not saying this to reopen anything. I'm saying it because I spent 6 years not seeing what was in front of me, and I'm trying to be done with that. He looked at her steadily. He sees you. She held his gaze for a moment. Take care of yourself, Gideon, she said. She stood up, put on her coat, picked up her bag. At the door she paused and looked back at him, sitting there with his coffee, smaller and realer than the man she'd married, which paradoxically made him more of a person than he'd been when she'd known him. And she said, The legitimate company. Build it right this time. He nodded. She went out into the street. Vittorio was waiting outside, not dramatically, not positioned, not making a statement. He was leaning against the building wall with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the street, and he turned when he heard the door and looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention that she'd catalogued as characteristic of him within the first 5 minutes of meeting him and had not been wrong about since. She looked at him. You followed me. I knew where you were going, he said. I didn't follow you. I came after. That's the same thing. It isn't quite, he said. Following is surveillance. Coming after is something else. She studied his face. He was, she'd concluded over the past 3 weeks, one of the more complex people she'd encountered in a life that had brought her into contact with a considerable number of complex people. He was also, and she'd resisted this conclusion for longer than it deserved, someone whose presence in a room changed the texture of it for her in a way she didn't entirely have language for. How much of the past 3 weeks, she said, has been you being professionally obligated to stay in proximity because the operation isn't fully closed, and how much is something else? He looked at her without flinching. Professionally, the operation will be closed within 2 weeks when the final evidence package is processed and the remaining members of Mercer's network are formally identified. He paused. Personally, I'd have been here anyway. Why? Because you interest me, he said. Not operationally. He paused again, choosing words with the same care she'd noticed from the first phone call. And because I've been in this work long enough to know that the number of people who can stand in a parking structure and find out their father allowed them to be targeted and then walk out and build a plan in 72 hours is, he stopped, small, very small. That's not an answer, she said. It's the honest version of the answer, he said. The direct version is that I don't want to stop knowing you, and I'm not in the habit of pretending I don't want what I want. She looked at him for a moment. The West Village street moved around them. Pedestrians, a delivery truck, a dog pulling its owner towards something interesting on the opposite sidewalk. The ordinary machinery of a city that had no opinion about what happened to anyone in particular. I'm difficult, she said. I know. I keep things from people. I know that too. He held her gaze. I'm not asking for perfect. I'm asking for what you're actually willing to give. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at him and felt the things she'd been carefully managing for 3 weeks, the things she'd been filing under professional proximity and operational necessity and various other accurate but incomplete descriptions, come to the surface with the specific inevitability of something that had been rising for a while and was done being held down. She was very tired of holding things down. Walk with me, she said. He fell into step beside her without comment, without the particular masculine version of triumph that she'd have filed away as a warning sign, without anything except the easy, unhurried presence of someone who had nowhere he needed to be other than where he was. They walked. Aldrich Voss pleaded to reduce charges 11 weeks later in exchange for a full accounting of his 7 years as a consultant to Leonard Mercer's private network. The accounting produced evidence that implicated 4 other individuals in the oversight structure he'd operated within. The hidden architecture above the architecture, the layer that people like Elara and Vittorio had spent careers working within without fully seeing. She read the legal summaries when Sable forwarded them. She did not attend any of the proceedings. She was not asked to, and she did not volunteer. Her father sent her a letter, physical, handwritten, delivered through a lawyer, 6 weeks after the gala. She received it, held it in her hands for a moment, and put it in the top drawer of her desk at the Vantage office, the drawer she kept for things she wasn't ready to address yet. It was a fuller drawer than she'd have liked. She understood that about herself. She didn't throw the letter away. That was the honest accounting of where she was with it. Not forgiveness, not resolution, not the clean narrative conclusion of a daughter and her father arriving at peace. Just the letter in the drawer, and the door left ajar rather than locked. She thought that was probably the most she could do right now, and she thought that was probably enough. The foundation was Vittorio's idea. He mentioned it one evening in late November. They were in her office, the good one, the corner office in the building she'd moved Vantage into 3 weeks after the gala, when the expanded client list made the original space unsustainable. And he said it the way he said things he'd been thinking about for a while and had decided to simply say. The assets recovered from Mercer's network, he said, after the criminal forfeiture process. There's going to be a significant remainder after restitution. I know, she said. She'd been following the asset recovery closely. There are people who were moved through that network, he said. People who were treated as cargo by an infrastructure that Leonard Mercer's money funded. Most of them are in difficult situations now. Legal status, documentation, access to basic things. He looked at her. The money that moved them through that system should do something for them. Not through a government bureaucracy that will spend 3 years deciding what to do with it. Something direct. She looked at him. I've been talking to a legal team about the mechanism, he said. But the direction, what it actually does, how it actually operates, I don't want to set that without you. Why not? Because you're the one who saw what the network was and built 3 years of work to stop it, he said simply. Because you should have a hand in what comes after. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the corner office window, the city was doing its November thing, early dark, the lit windows of the buildings across the street, the specific quality of the air that came before the first real cold of winter. I'll want operational control of the program design, she said, obviously. And I'll want Sable on the oversight board. Done. And I'll want... She stopped. He waited. I'll want it to be unglamorous, she said. Not a foundation with a gala and a projection wall and 500 people in formal wear. Something that does the work without making a show of it. He almost smiled. I had a feeling you'd say that. The gala was necessary, she said. It's not a template. Agreed, he said. She turned back to the window. She was thinking in the way she thought when something was taking shape. Not in words yet, but in the specific internal architecture of a thing being designed. The money that had moved people as cargo, building something for those people. It wasn't redemption. Redemption was a word that suggested the original harm could be balanced against something, and she didn't believe in that kind of accounting. But it was something. It was the use of the wreckage to build something that the wreckage had destroyed, and that was the closest you could get, and she thought that was worth doing. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Buon. The night they opened the Foundation's first operational office, a set of rooms in a building in the Bronx, nothing remarkable, the kind of space that got work done without announcing itself. It was raining. A cold November rain that turned the sidewalks slick and made the city look like a photograph taken through wet glass. Vittorio had brought 3 people from his end. She'd brought Sable and 2 others from Vantage. They stood in the main room of the office, folding tables, stacked chairs, the smell of fresh paint, boxes of files that needed to be organized, and looked at each other with the particular awkwardness of people who were used to doing things under difficult circumstances and were now in the slightly unfamiliar territory of a beginning rather than a crisis. She poured bad coffee from a machine that was the first thing they'd plugged in. She handed a cup to Vittorio. He took it and looked at her over the rim and said nothing, which was the right thing. She looked around the room, at the folding tables and the stacked chairs and the boxes of files and the wet November city outside the window and the people she'd chosen to be in this room with her, and she felt something settle in her chest that she didn't immediately have a word for. Not happiness, exactly. Or not only happiness. The feeling of a person who had been braced against something for a very long time and had finally, carefully, stopped bracing. She took a sip of the bad coffee. It was genuinely terrible. The machine was already on her list for replacement. "We need a better coffee setup," she said. "First thing tomorrow," Sable said. "First thing tomorrow," Elara agreed, and that was where the night settled, not in triumph or in clean resolution, but in a room that smelled like paint and bad coffee and the specific possibility of work that needed doing, in the company of people she'd chosen, and a man standing close enough that their arms were almost touching, in a city that didn't care what any particular person made of their particular life. She had made something of hers. Not the life she'd planned, not any version of the life she'd imagined at any point in the years behind her. The life she'd actually built, out of the material of what had actually happened, with the specific and unglamorous tools of stubbornness and work, and the willingness to keep going after the point where stopping would have been reasonable. It wasn't a clean story. It didn't have clean edges. Her father was still in the top drawer. Gideon was building something smaller and realer than what he'd had. 3 men who'd been positioned at exits during a gala were accounted for, and one wasn't. The foundation would be difficult and slow and would fail in ways she couldn't predict yet, and she would have to adapt. And adaptation was never comfortable. She knew all of this. She stood in the room and knew all of this and stayed standing. Outside, the November rain came down on the city and made the streets shine. And tomorrow the work would begin, and it would be hard, and she was ready for it to be hard. She had never needed it to be easy. She had only ever needed it to be hers. This is a work of fiction. All characters, organizations, events, and locations depicted are entirely imaginary and created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is entirely coincidental.